It's been about 4 months that I've been trying to get this car started, and it's been just kicking my butt and consuming a whole bunch of time, and unfortunately I've been running into a wall. So what I'm hoping to do in this video is I'm going to walk you guys through everything that I've checked and how I've checked it. I'm going to test my video editing skills and cut in the way I was doing each of these tests so that you guys can see and validate that everything is good. But here's what I started out with. So basic principles for an engine to fire: needs fuel, air, and spark. Then it gets compressed and explosion happens, good things happen, right? So starting off with the most basic thing, I started off by doing a compression test. I've got in cylinder 1 again, I've got the normal spark plug still down in the hole. I've got the compression tester screwed into the second spark plug hole, and I'll go and crank it now, and we should be able to watch this spin up. So you can see it's up just over 150 psi, which is pretty good. So did a compression test, and I had about 150 psi in all cylinders, which is plenty, and they're all within about 5 to 7 psi variability amongst the 8 cylinders, so which tells me I don't think I have a compression issue. The next thing I checked was going through the fuel system. So I validated that I have fuel at the rail, and it's pretty easy because I have an external fuel pressure regulator, and it has a gauge on it which tells me that I've got 58 psi of fuel at the rail, which is what the injectors are calibrated for and what the Holley ECU is set up for. So that should be good. Then there's 2 wires that go to each injector, power and ground. So with this Holley EFI system, it is a constant power to each of the injectors, and then it pulses the ground to tell the injector when to fire. So I used an idiot light on the injectors and validated that they have power, and the same thing for the ground. I was able to tie into the ground system and on the way back to the ECU and validate that it has power going through it. So I don't think that's the concern. And then the last item here is fuel in the cylinder. Honestly, at this point, I don't have a really good way of trying to validate that. I can't figure out a way to fire the injector off to the side. Now, I have removed an injector and validate as you kind of hook up power, you can hear the click, click, click that you're supposed to hear in an injector as it does its pulsing. But maybe because the injector sat there for so long, they're not functioning correctly. So new injectors on order. We'll see if that helps. After that, I worked my way through the ignition system. So I looked at power to the coil. There's 8 coil packs on this engine, and they each have a waste spark setup which ties into a cylinder on the opposing bank. It was easy to validate that there's power to each coil, once again using the light, and then validating that there's spark going to each plug. So what I've got set up now is I've got the waste spark wire that goes from coil pack 1 over there all the way across over to cylinder 6. I've got the boot from it tied into this little basic spark tester and grounded, so as the engine spins over we should be able to see spark happening in here, and if spark is there, there's spark happening at cylinder 1 as well because it's coming from the same coil pack. Same design as this, so this integrated boot design goes down into the main cylinder, but it has this little branch into this mess of spaghetti wires that goes across to fire that opposing cylinder. So I'm going to go spin it over, and you should be able to see spark happening. And validated that that is good. So I checked power with the light, and I checked spark to the plugs with the tester. But in terms of validating that there's spark in each cylinder, there's not really a good way, once again, for me to check that. There's not really a good way to validate that. But if you have fuel and spark and your compression is good, the only thing that could be then messing with you is just the timing, how everything is linked. So first off, mechanical, if the compression test passed, this should be good, but the cam to the crank are connected via a chain, And when you're assembling an engine, it's very important to get those correctly oriented to each other when you do that first assembly. But when this engine was out of a running vehicle that I got, and it has never been taken apart, so that should not be an issue for me. I didn't take it apart. I have not disassembled the front end of the engine, but when I do my checks for top dead center, when I do my checks that way, I would have the engine open from the valve cover side, and you can see that the valves are closed when they're supposed to be and open when they're supposed to be. So if it's off by a tooth, and it's, 36 teeth on there, it'd be off by not very much, right? It'd be off by a few degrees in terms of the valves to the piston. You can't detect that by eye, but I'm kind of relying on the fact that it is the stock assembly and it came out of a running vehicle. It hasn't been touched, so it should be in okay shape. And then the cam and the crank sensors. So on the Hemi, we'll start with the crank sensor. It's just a proximity sensor. So the wheel that's on the crank is a 36-toothed wheel with a gap in it. And what this does is, as the gap goes by this proximity sensor, it detects that gap and kind of uses that to orient itself to know where top dead center is on the crankshaft. And then it has a similar one that is in the camshaft so that it knows where it is as well. So when you start digging into how the timing works in detail, I've got a little diagram here I'll walk you guys through to show you what I've been thinking. This is my basic understanding of how it all works. So for the crank to go through one full cycle of a 4-stroke engine, it does 2 full revolutions. So in revolution 1, the piston comes up for compression. That's called top dead center. Spark happens at that point, and you can either advance or retard the spark based on how you set up your ignition system. Once that spark happens, the power stroke happens. The explosion pushes the crank back down, so that's completed 1 full revolution there. Then in revolution 2, when the piston comes back up, the exhaust valve is open and pushes all the exhaust out. Then exhaust valve closed, intake valve opens. So in the intake stroke, piston comes down, draws a vacuum, fills the combustion chamber full of all that fuel-rich air from the intake manifold, and then it goes back to the start. So the cam only does 1 rotation to every 2 rotations of the crank, just with the way it's all linked and the way that the valve system works. So fairly basic. And what I think is kind of interesting is on this engine that I have, it has that waste spark setup like I mentioned before. So spark plug 1 from coil 1 fires right around top dead center at the beginning there. But spark plug number 6 from coil 6, I guess, through the waste spark setup, fires a waste spark into this cylinder number 1 in the exhaust stroke way over here on rotation 2. So it's kind of interesting, and that's why Hemis have the 2 spark plugs per cylinder. It's not that they're both firing during the power stroke up here or to generate the power stroke. In this waste spark setup, one's actually firing way over here.